have to go to work. See you later.
Good evening, everyone. It is 6 o'clock, and we will call the meeting to order. This is the March 17th meeting of the Santa Barbara County Citizens Independent Redistricting Commission. We welcome those of you from the public that are watching our meeting this evening. It's good to see the rest of the commissioners as well. And we want to welcome Andrea Sheridan Norton, our new counsel. For the commission. We'll hear probably a little more from her as the meeting goes on. But Ms. Orton, we want to just acknowledge that you're joining us for the first time and welcome you.
And Mr. Wucher is also, he's on the attendees list, so we're seeing about getting him moved over to the panelist.
All right. So with that, Ms. Tilton, could I ask you to call roll?
Yes. District 1, Commissioner Trotsky.
Present.
District 1, Commissioner Twibell.
Present.
District 2, Commissioner McClintock.
Present.
District 2, Commissioner Turley.
Present.
District 3, Commissioner Bradley.
Present.
District 3, Commissioner Hudley.
Present.
District 4, Commissioner Bray.
Present.
District 4, Commissioner Ochoa.
Present.
District 5, Commissioner Rios.
Present.
And then member at large, Commissioner Omedo. He acknowledged that he is will be hopping on in just a few minutes. He just had to finish up some work detail. And Chair Morris.
Present. All right. With that, let me formally introduce our legal counsel. We have with us today two representatives of our team. Ms. Orton, I acknowledged earlier, and Mr. Wucher. And we found a way to pull you in from the hallway, so welcome. Glad to have you both here. Let me just give you a quick moment to introduce yourselves. Andrea, looks like you're muted still.
It's a great pleasure to meet you again, and it is a greater pleasure to now be able to represent you. This is a very exciting and demanding responsibility that you've taken on, and I really admire that degree of energy that you have shown thus far, and I know will show throughout the year. My life has been in the law for more than 50 years, about half of the time in governmental entities, representing various entities. The Los Angeles County Council. I was United States Attorney in the Central District of California, and very proudly served twice in the State Attorney General's office in the consumer and civil rights and environmental sections of those offices. But I've also been in big law, and I find this to be a very engaging project that you are in, and I'm just happy to be part of it. And I don't know, there's Fred.
Here I am. I made it. It was a little bit of a slog getting here, and we will be discussing that a little further in closed session, which is the main reason that I'm here. Andrea will be your lead person handling the meeting, and we don't want you to think that we're all overwhelming you with lawyers. So I just wanted to make a brief appearance to say hello here. I'm actually going to turn my video off so I'm not distracting, and Andrea will be in charge of the open session the meeting, and then when we get to closed session, I'll come back in to discuss some of the matters as to where things stand. But we're thrilled to be here, and we've been watching all the videos as we were waiting to see whether we would be able to join you, and very impressed with how the progress you're making, and look forward to trying to help you as you bring this home. Thanks.
And Mr. Chairman, I see Justin Levitt is actually in the attendees list, so I can see if I can move him over here. Okay. If you want to introduce him as well. See if I do this.
There we go. Professor Levitt, it looks like we found you wandering the halls as well. How are you this evening?
You did indeed. Thank you. And thank you, Doug, for pulling me in. I greatly appreciate that. I'm doing well. I'm also going to allow my esteemed co-counsel, Andrea, to help guide you all through today's meeting, and like Fred, try not to distract. But I also am really pleased to be joining you. Thanks again for the invitation.
Well, thank you. Look forward to it. Commissioners, next item on our agenda is disclosure of ex parte communications. You should have all received an email from staff with the links to the new form that we're going to be using. Mr. Johnson, do you want to give a quick summary of that and maybe point to where the results can be found online for our members of the public?
Yes, indeed. Let me bring that up here. There we go. Okay, let me share my screen real quick. We'll have you just comment if commissioners have anything to disclose, since this is the first time, but so people can see it. If they go to the main redistricting website, if you just Google Santa Barbara County Redistricting, you'll get this page, but it's countyofsb.org/redistricting.sbc. And then a couple of things are new here. To the point of this discussion, we have the ex parte disclosures link down here. And if one clicks on that, it takes a second to load, but then each commissioner's name is listed down below. And people can just click through and see whatever that commissioner has entered. Now, we did just send these links out yesterday, so I didn't expect you all to have a chance to do this, but we did get it set up as a form for each of you to enter your ex parte communications going forward. And then, like I said, on anyone that wants to review them at any time can go to the county website, and it's that, and click on that point, and just at each meeting we'll just remind the public that that's where they're at going forward, so be sure to put them up there. So
very good. Since this was the first time and the form just came out, is there anybody that has anything to report that you didn't get a chance to enter onto the form yet? Okay, seeing none, again, in the future, we will just reference that link as part of the agenda so that folks can find it on their own. We are now at a point where we're ready for general public comment. Ms. Tilton, would you like to introduce the process we will use and determine whether we have any requests to speak this evening?
Yes, today's meeting is remote, virtual only through the Zoom webinar information identified on the public agenda. The meeting is being recorded and will be available for viewing on the internet at www.countyofsb.org/redistricting.sbc. Public participation during the meeting can only be done through the Zoom webinar link or by calling the phone number provided on the agenda. For those using the Zoom webinar link, please indicate that you wish to speak during public comment by selecting the raise your hand feature. Attendees by phone can raise your hand by pressing *9. When called upon, please state your name for the record. We reserve the right to mute a microphone for profane, harassing, or offensive language, or for speaking beyond the time limit set, and the time limit set for public comment is set at 3 minutes. Recordings of the commission meetings, agenda, supplemental materials, and minutes of the commission are available on the internet at the same redistricting page cited earlier at countyofsb.org/redistricting.sbc.
And do we have any requests to speak this evening?
Yes, we have a request to speak from Scott Rafferty.
Good evening, Mr. Rafferty.
Yes, I just want to make a few comments about transparency, and I make them out of concern, quite frankly, that the commission is, to some extent, discrediting a lot of the objectives of independent redistricting. Public comments to publish an agenda in 72 hours and require people to have things 25 hours before the meeting, that's really unusual. Is it consistent with the Brown Act under the current circumstances? I'm not going to opine on that. It's just not a best practice. It belies that you're acting as agents of the voters. Public records. The county is way overdue on a Public Record Act request, and it's apparently because many of your records have been going through NDC's private email accounts. That's a problem, not an excuse. And those documents need to be produced. Mr. Churchwell went out with a lot of style. I really thought his explanation of ex parte was very good. He emphasized that you should behave as though you're quasi-judicial, that you're agents implementing the will of the voters. And you should, he commended a statute which said you should avoid ex parte when possible. Well, it is always possible to avoid initiating or responding to an ex parte. You can have somebody walk up to you on the street and say something, and that you should report. But there was a lot of confusion, I think, on behalf of the chair and Dr. Johnson about what was ex parte. When are you going to consider this issue? That's not procedural. That's very valuable information that puts someone at an advantage. What was it like to feel to view this issue? Or that is also an insight into the decision-making process, which really should not be dished out. Finally, you're having a closed session this evening about litigation. And I think we should have an open session soon about why you think you have litigation authority. Because I don't see it in the ordinance, I don't see it in the general law, and it suggests that you're just going to be fighting. The chair has said voting rights is an advocacy. It's the mandate of this commission. And you should not have a blank check. Nobody elected you. You should not have a blank check to just litigate and then return to your private lives. So I am concerned. I think you've done some damage here to the objectives, and I hope you take transparency much more seriously in the future. To say, for example, I got a call from a newspaper reporter and we discussed Doug Johnson's contract. That raises more questions than it answers. So thank you very much, and I hope things improve.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Tilton, any other requests?
I do not see any hands raised.
Very good. We'll close this this round of public comment. Are there any written communications that need to be entered into the record?
There were no written communications submitted for this meeting.
Very well. All right. We will close public comment at this point and move to agenda item number 5, the approval of minutes from our March 3rd meeting. Commissioners, if no one has anything to correct in the minutes, I would take a motion to accept. Mr. Bradley.
Yes, motion to accept minutes of the 3rd as correct.
Well, is there a second? Ms. Rios.
I make a motion to accept the minutes from March 3rd.
All right, so we have a motion from Commissioner Bradley and a second from Commissioner Rios. Ms. Tilton, roll call, please.
Commissioner Trosky. Commissioner Twibell.
Karen, we need you to unmute. There you go.
Commissioner McClintock.
Aye.
Commissioner Turley.
Aye.
Commissioner Bradley.
Aye.
Commissioner Hudley.
Aye.
Commissioner Bray.
Aye.
Commissioner Ochoa.
Aye.
Commissioner Rios.
Aye.
And I don't believe Commissioner Olmedo has joined us yet. And Chair Morris.
Aye. Very well. Next item on our agenda, number 6, a planning discussion on the commission's outreach efforts. Mr. Johnson, I see you turned your camera on. I'm guessing you want to start us on this.
Yes, indeed. I will note we have a short list of things on the agenda tonight, but the things on there we're going to be pretty in depth. So looking forward to getting into the nuts and bolts of this tonight. So with outreach, a couple of things. First of all, a basic item. Let me go back to sharing my screen again for the website. The other change on the commission's website is at the top, we had put this language at the last meeting about group, anyone can submit an organization that they think might be interested in this process. But we discovered that was a Google Sheet and I had not set that up correctly. So that has now been fixed. So people have two options. Number one, they can look at the list to see who's already on there. No need to submit a group that's already on there. And then they can just click this form, and very similar to your ex parte disclosure forms, it brings up this form where they can enter the organization's name, who that organization has as their audience that we connect through them, their website, phone number, and email address. And as noted here, this information all goes public, so people shouldn't be posting private email addresses. These should just be public contact information for those groups. So, and then the organizations that are submitted are all available for anyone to view. And we've actually kind of borrowed this form. So this is where they appear. And just today we pre-populated it with lists actually that Gina from the county staff was kind enough to provide, which is she had organization contact lists from the Census Complete Count Committee efforts for the county. So we have about 78 of those groups listed here to get us started. And then she also has a list of religious organizations in the county it's a public list from online that we've added. So you see the list here, and then other groups will enter and fill in their information as people submit it. So we're already at about 258 organizations to contact, which is a good start, but only a start still. So that piece of the outreach discussion is really just an update to let you know this sheet is here. We'll eventually be taking this into more of a formal, communications plan, but for now, it's a good list to start from of identifying groups in the county who we hope will get involved in this process. So that is the first piece, is just that update that link now works. Before, if you went there, it took you to a page that people couldn't enter anything on. So it's now working. So that's a good start.
Mr. Johnson, really quick, Commissioner Turley has a question.
Oh, yes. Thank you.
Thanks. Sorry to interrupt. Is there a way to move the button that says the ability to select a language and translate into Spanish down further on the page so it's more obvious? I was kind of searching for it and it was hard to find.
Oh, let me show the screen so everyone can see what you're talking about.
On the redistricting website. Yeah, it's up at the top on the banner. But when the page loads, it often doesn't necessarily load with the banner. It loads underneath it. So you have to actually scroll up to find that.
Yeah, we can actually check on that. I'm not sure if that's part of the county's whole website architecture or if it can be changed, but it's a good comment. We can certainly.
Yeah, I wonder if that's the case, if we could just add it again somewhere on the page so that it's easy to find.
Sure. Yeah, we can follow up with the web team and report back to you on that, certainly.
Thank you.
Yeah, let me make a note here. Button. Okay, so that part was mainly informational for all of you. The next piece is we were taking what the commissioners had shared with us last time. There's been discussions of needing collateral, flyers, presentations, all that kind of stuff. So we had a discussion with Gina and Nancy from county staff. And the thought is, we obviously want to get this rolling, but the county's outreach staff has limited personnel. And as you all are very aware, there's a lot going on right now in terms of communications from the county. So their suggestion was, we have some outreach folks that have prepared material like this with us on a number of redistricting projects, that we'll just bring them in and we can get them working actually possibly this week or more likely next week to kind of come up with initial thoughts and materials to share with you if you're comfortable with that. And the thought is to have them put together, we talked about a flyer that could be put in, that local businesses can put in their window, that all of you can use, and that all the folks that we're hoping will help us with outreach can distribute. Obviously, social media content and email messaging, working with you and with county staff, because we want these messages to still have a county feel, so people recognize them as being county materials. We'd have these folks really give us the time and the manpower to get those done. So wanted to come back to you both with that suggestion, and also to get your sense of what you would like to see them prepare.
Thank you, Doug. Would this include a PowerPoint presentation that we as commissioners could literally, load and take out to civic organizations, service clubs, and present?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's definitely a big part of it. I think would be something that we can share, that you can share both in person and actually you can share virtually nowadays to get this going. And later on this list of things, actually I should, later on the list is coming back to the idea that we've discussed a couple times about enlisting the other applicants for the commission and creating this outreach team too. Then we'll come back to that after this discussion, after this item. But yeah, no, an outreach presentation was in there. Perhaps a bilingual video clip, kind of an informational video that we could put on the website, and that you could also show when you go to these groups. And that, hopefully high school teachers can show their classes and college professors can show their classes to get them involved. The commissioners have previously asked about radio advertisements, especially Spanish radio. So that kind of thing they could help with. And all this, of course, would be bilingual. The other piece that I was wondering if there's commission interest in is we have in the past done op-ed pieces to run in local news outlets under the chair or commissioner's names. These folks could help with writing those and drafting those, obviously with whoever's name it's going to run under. And the thought obviously is all of you have a lot of experience in these kinds of materials. So obviously you guys would be reviewing and signing off on anything before it was final. Any other thoughts about, as we talk to these folks about what to bring on, what you'd like to see?
Yes, I see Commissioner Twibell and then Commissioner Bradley.
I just had a question about, should we have the COVID-19 protocol in place before we get any of this information, so we know that when we're a representative, we're doing it properly? I know things are changing a lot, but I wouldn't feel comfortable going to a group that isn't following a protocol.
Yeah, I mean, I would defer to the other commissioners. My suspicion, as you kind of hinted, is that the protocols are changing so fast. I think a lot of it will simply have to be your comfort levels. I don't think there's any expectations for anyone to go to anything they're comfortable with. And I don't expect much being in person anytime soon. You all may know of groups that are meeting, but I'm not familiar with any kind of groups, community organizations where you do a presentation like this that's meeting in person these days.
Mr. Bradley.
I think it'd be very helpful to have some preliminary information to explain to the public exactly what redistricting is. I know last time we heard quite a bit about the differences between reapportionment and redistricting. I think the public often is confused about basic legalisms like that. And the process and its background history, since there are only 3 counties in California, is somewhat unfamiliar to most of our residents. And I know yesterday I very quickly talked to a consortium of educators and vocational groups for the central county, just to invite them into the, to get on the list. And I made a sort of crib note to work from, and I think it would be helpful to have a kind of crib note for each of us that we could, use as some basic introductory comments. I think one of the things we don't want to see happen is have everything turn into sort of a mosh pit where everyone just piles on every single thought that's in their head. So it'll be useful to front load our presentations with a little bit of context and history so that when we meet with these groups, we are able to channel their energy and their input where it needs to go.
Makes great sense, Stefan.
Yeah, Commissioner Rios.
Yes, and I think too, when going out and doing these presentations, whether virtual or what format it is on the radio, just remembering that Spanish is not our only language that is very commonly spoken in a lot of the Central Coast. We do have a large Mixteco community in this area. I know oftentimes, I'm a part of a group right now that is talking about our Filipino community, how we did an event and we didn't have any translation available for them. And so just considering other groups that are not Latinx as well, so that they can engage in this conversation. I know I'm guilty of this. Traditionally, I often say, oh, we need Spanish translation or Mixteco translation, but just being aware of what other groups might need translation as well.
Now, let me ask a question on that. Because obviously few people realize that Filipinos actually were the largest minority group for decades, or largest Asian American group for a long time in California. They recently slipped to second. But the Filipino groups that you dealt with, are there non-English speakers in that group? I know different communities vary about whether or not, and I don't know Santa Barbara's Filipino community very well.
I have to say it varies. I can't really say there are non-English people that don't speak English, but I definitely think that, I can only speak for Santa Maria right now. I know there is a large population, at least in Santa Maria. But it'd be interesting to see the other cities, what their populations are once that census comes out and we start doing outreach.
Will do.
So, Doug, it seems to me that you're probably talking about a couple of different sets of presentation materials, right? So, to go out and do a bunch of radio ads today about, help us draw the lines is probably premature. But to Norman's point, now may be the point where it's just about softening the ground and educating people about the concept. And then at some point we'll need to put that presentation away and pull out another one. Is that kind of how you're envisioning this?
Yes, exactly. I anticipate there's typically 3 waves of information you send out. First is, we're getting started, come tell us about your neighborhoods, kind of thing. The next is draft. You either submit your own draft map or start following the draft maps and let us know what you think about them. And then the biggest wave is, here are the final maps. Which ones do you prefer? But you're definitely right. As you said, soften the ground is key. Our rule of thumb is you'll typically get twice as many people involved once you have maps for people to react to. As Commissioner Bradley said, this is, we have to explain this issue a lot in the absence of maps. Once there's a map cutting through your town, people instantly get it and then show up. But yes, I think we're definitely talking about probably 3 waves of communication, and each one have very different materials in it.
Yeah, Commissioner Rios.
And just to confirm, this will help us keep consistency, right? That way we're all presenting the same information, and not that it's scripted, but definitely ensuring that, I didn't leave anything out regarding X, Y, and Z, right? Because I think that was what was making me nervous about the outreach piece. I was like, are we going to have something to go off of? But this is great. So thank you.
Yeah, and that's exactly the thought, is to prepare a presentation. So you'd all have the same presentation you'd be giving, you'd all have the same leave behind. You'd be leaving with those folks, even if it's a virtual leave behind. And you'd all be referring them to the same website, video materials to share with people that didn't make it to the meeting. So, yeah. Sounds good. Okay. Well, and if folks, obviously these are the ideas we're discussing today, I'm going to take to the communications experts and get them to work up. They've worked with Palm Desert and a number of jurisdictions with us, so they know redistricting and they know exactly what we need in terms of what the heck is this crazy issue and how do we put that in common sense English. So,
Doug, one other question: at what point in that cycle would you anticipate, the creation of the Facebook page or and I don't know what all channels, and maybe some of the commissioners have got some specific recommendations around, which platforms, which channels we need to be active on. And is that something you would see these contractors, would that be among their first set of tasks, is to just get that infrastructure in place?
yes, and it's one of the conversations that Gina DePinto from the county has raised with some very good pros and cons, and obviously some of you have touched on is, should there be a commission presence in Facebook, and should there be a commission presence in Instagram, or should it be more commission messaging going through the county's existing presence? One way you get a much more focused message, the other you get a much larger audience. So that's something I think, certainly outside of my focus and expertise. I think that the consultants and Ms. DePinto are probably better positioned to work with you on which way you prefer for each of these channels. And it may be different. You may want to use the county's Facebook channel and your own Instagram channel or something like that. But that's something that we definitely have you work with them on.
Okay, Commissioner Rios.
I think both are good because I definitely think they both serve different audiences. Like I think of Instagram, our younger community, if we're trying to outreach to high school students too, our college students. Like I know that's something being very highly used, and I use Facebook more than versus younger people. I know they're not on Facebook right now from what I'm hearing. So just definitely thinking of what each audience uses more, where we're going to find them if we're trying to target a specific group. I think that will be helpful to keep in mind.
Commissioner Turley.
Yeah, I agree with what Commissioner Rio said. Also, I'm curious what existing social media accounts the county has and who their followers are. So that would be nice to know kind of going in. And then also, I know that we had kind of discussed initially the fact that it's technically not allowed for us to be using our personal social media accounts for this. So if we were to use social media, I think we would have to create a commission-based account if we weren't using the county accounts, but correct me if I'm wrong there.
Yes, actually, Andrea, when we were chatting, just kind of having get to know, said we should probably get an ex parte communication agenda item on. Andrea, did you say for next meeting? I think it was too quick to get it on this one. Andrea, you're muted. So.
We can add social media on at that time too.
Yeah, because there's a lot to go into about both the rules of ex parte and the sharing information versus engaging in conversations in social media questions. So we'll certainly come back to you with that well before we actually go live with these things.
Any other questions or discussion? When we're finished with this, we'll want to take a little public comment on it. But before we do that, anything else from the commissioners?
I do have a couple of other miscellaneous outreach things really to put on your thinking caps for. There had been an offhand comment at the last meeting we wanted to circle back on. You don't have to discuss it today unless you want to, but the idea of coming up with a catchphrase. Ms. Tilton, you may remember last time read the name of the commission as in the ordinance, and I think it took almost 45 seconds to read that name. So I don't know if folks have thought about a catchphrase or want to. Actually, my thought was maybe I'll have my Google Sheets person throw a quick survey up so residents can submit names if you want to, unless you have names you've thought of already. So. My kids' high school is looking for a new mascot, and they just put up a Google Sheets survey and got 300 suggestions. So we can certainly do that and see how we do. But something, wanted to circle back on that, and certainly when we get those materials together, we'll want that. The other piece really to have you think about, and we can put this more as a substantive item on a later meeting, is I think we're now at that point to start talking about this outreach advisory team. You know, we've talked about enlisting the folks that applied for the commission and didn't get chosen, or now we have our star advisors who have been briefly on the commission, who certainly are still interested in the commission's work and I think would be love to be a part of that. But obviously we want them to have that same collateral materials before they start doing anything, but enlisting, organizing them is something we should, that you all should start thinking about, and we'll have our consultants help guide us on the best way to structure that. But something for you to think about.
Mr. Bradley.
Yeah, Mr. Johnson, I didn't want you to be met with silence on your suggestion. I think it's an excellent idea. It'd be a really wonderful way to open the doors to the public by starting by having them name what we want to call this. I think that's a great way to introduce this process to the public. So I would certainly endorse that approach, whether it's high school students or public, in general. Maybe we could set some sort of a appendage to our website where people can do that. Would that be possible? Add one more labor to your long list of things to do with our website.
Yes, indeed. And this is, you can see how this discussion quite quickly got to, we need some help on this. So we can do that. And the other piece too, we've worked with so many different commissions across the state that we can pull, give examples. So in the survey, we'll say, here are some examples to get you thinking about other places, and let's come up with something new. That could definitely work. And then the last thing for you to think about, again, you don't have to answer tonight, but unless you want to, the state commission has just started, they haven't started doing them, but they've invited organizations to ask for them. They're planning what they call education outreach meetings. It's just like what we were talking about. What the heck is the state commission doing? How can people get involved? So one thought is to, well, the question for you all to consider is it too much mixing in the message to do a joint state commission, county commission education effort? Maybe do not a formal hearing, but an information session for the public. Something like that, where we would invite them, schedule it together, and have them do their education piece and follow it with a county education piece. Or is that too much of mixing the messages and you think that might confuse folks?
Rather.
I think we could learn a lot from their experience. They've been on this trail a lot longer than we have, but I think we'd have to be extremely cautious to explain to the audience that what they're doing is politically quite different from what we're doing here at a county level. So I would just have that caveat put up front, very clear to the public, that what's happening at the state level is a somewhat different process than what we're doing with different outcomes. So as long as we can put that in place, that would probably be very useful.
Mr. Bradley, I think you're on a good point there. I think I can actually see a workshop or an informational session that explains kind of the whole pie, the whole universe of this, because I think otherwise we will get folks coming to us thinking that we're, helping with the assembly districts or vice versa. And if that were recorded and available on the website, so we could kind of go, here's the 101, right? And it would, really kind of cover, this is what they're doing, this is what we're doing, here's how they're similar, and here's where they're not. That may have some value. Ms. Turley. And then Ms. Trotsky.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's a great idea. And also, if we communicated with them ahead of time to make it clear that this was going to be a recorded resource and that we were basically doing something like Redistricting 101, that they could make things simple and visual, and that it could be something that we could share later, that would be extremely useful.
Yeah, thank you. Ms. Trotsky. Mute.
There we go. Okay. I think that it would be mixed messaging and a bit confusing. I mean, the public's already confused on what we're about. And so I think it would be helpful. I think it it would be helpful to view the material that the state has, incorporate it into our presentation, and then if someone wanted to do a deeper dive, say, here's the material on our website, direct them to that they could look at it more in depth. But I wouldn't want to confuse the two issues. I'd like to keep the public focused on the Santa Barbara County focused on what we're doing. And if they wanted to learn more, we would have the materials available to them on the website.
Let me just acknowledge that Commissioner Olmedo has joined us this evening. Welcome, Ben. Glad you're here.
Thank you. Sorry, I was running a little late.
It's all right.
Well, given that, like I said, the state just announced they're starting this process. So we'll get in touch with them, see exactly what they're doing in terms of virtual presentations or videos or collateral material, and come back to you and with that before asking for a final decision on what to do with this. Because obviously we wouldn't want to do it before we have our presentation ready as well. So if that works.
Doug, as you're talking through these items, and this may be premature, but it seems to me that as you bring on some staff capacity to help with this or with the outreach, it might be useful for us to appoint a subcommittee to kind of work with them kind of on the side, come up with the recommended strategies, come back to our group and, have a more framed conversation or presentation and response. Again, we may not need to pick, volunteers tonight. But it seems like having a working group that, you're not trying to get 11 of us to all, agree to the, each color scheme and palette choice might be helpful.
Yeah, I suspect that will be the case. I think we'll want to get them on board and make sure that they're comfortable with that. But yeah, I think you're exactly right. The idea of trying to go, 3 rounds of revisions in a live full commission meeting might be a little much. It might be better to get a subcommittee, definitely. So.
Yeah. Ms. Trusky, yes.
Will we have a chance to review the state's materials before we make our materials? I mean, there might be something useful in what they're saying that could be incorporated into what we're doing, or their formatting, or something that might be useful in advance.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that I think their outreach budget is $500,000 or more, so I think we can definitely benefit from some of that spending. I haven't looked at their materials yet, so I'll find out and we'll come back to you and share everything they've got. I'm not sure. I don't think they're that much farther ahead in the outreach part of this than we are, because they've spent a lot of time on other issues. For those that don't know, they actually lost their executive director, I think 3 weeks ago. And then this week they lost their general counsel. So they've been kind of feeling some bumps and bruises along the way as well. So yes, I think we may be working in parallel, but to the degree we can get their materials, we will share that with you, certainly.
Right. So commissioners, I guess I would just, leave that point as if that's, give that some consideration. If you think you've got some, A, interest, and B, extra time to engage in some, working sessions outside of our normal cadence, we'd, love to have, some volunteers. We'll probably address that at our next meeting, so you get some time to kind of give that some thought.
And before we move off this topic, I would check with Gina. I see she's on. Gina, anything I missed or that you want to mention? For those that haven't met her, Gina DePinto is the county's public information officer.
Hi, good evening. I just realized I don't have my live camera on. It's just my photo. No, I mean, I think if there were specific questions, I'm happy to answer. I think in general, what we hope to do is fully support the commission, but because it is an independent commission, we want to make sure that it does not have that appearance that we're directing this in any way. Of course, we're here as advisors and experts, and we do have all of our communication channels that we will want to share information because of the audience that is looking for information from or about the county. So we'll be working, with the outreach consultants and of course NDC and all of you. So we're not going away. We just really want to make sure that it is an independent commission and that's really clear. So that's why we've branded it without the county logo. So happy to answer any specific questions and be working with you along the way.
Thank you very much. Anybody have any questions from the commission for Ms. Pinto?
I know that Commissioner Turley asked about which channels we have. The county has our main social media channels are Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, all found at the call name of County of SB. And we can give you breakdowns and statistics. Our Twitter is over 20,000 followers. Facebook is over 12,000. Instagram about 80, almost 8,400. And then we also have, of course, CSB TV, and which operates our YouTube channel where we post the videos, actually host the videos of these meetings. And we can put up PSAs. I know we created slides for CSB TV to air when we were actually recruiting all of you, or posting the available opportunity to apply, I should say. Of course, we have e-news with different lists that the public has signed up to receive news from the county. So we do use our general e-news list to alert the public after these agendas have been posted. And then putting up social media to also let people know about the meetings and trying to engage the public to join. Those are the primary. And then we've made announcements at board meetings, things like that.
Good, thank you.
And just to give you a little bit of kind of the big picture time frame I'm thinking of is we have this session, and then the next two meetings we have scheduled kind of training sessions, today on data, next on criteria, and then last on the Voting Rights Act. Kind of finished with the big one. So we'll kind of be in brainstorming and getting things together mode through those meetings. And the thought is once we finish those, hopefully right around that same time, we'll have the collateral close to ready so that as you've gone through all those discussions and hopefully feel comfortable presenting and talking to people in the community, we would also have the materials ready. So we can kind of launch just as you are feeling ready to launch, if that makes sense.
Can I add one more thing I forgot to mention? We do have a Twitter account in Spanish. It's not heavily followed, but we do put bilingual materials out on all of our other channels. So I think it's just our Spanish Twitter is not necessarily followed that much. And then also in response to Indigenous languages, mixed tech, because it's not a written language, we tend to work with MyCop and Cause and organizations, and they basically translate from our Spanish versions into, for video and radio and a lot of direct grassroots outreach, they'll translate from Spanish to mixed tech.
Okay, that's all I had for outreach.
Okay, let's pause for a moment and see if we have any public comment related to this item. Ms. Tilton, any hands being raised?
Yes, we do. We have a request to speak from Spencer Brandt, followed by Lee Heller.
Good evening, Mr. Brandt.
Good evening, Chair Morrison, Commission. I hope everyone's having a great Wednesday. So my comment, I wanted to talk a little bit about something that I've seen a lot, which is that when we talk about outreach, oftentimes there's a huge chasm between what everyone's understanding of the word outreach can mean. For some people, outreach is one-way communication. We've talked about some of those ways, things like Facebook, things like Twitter. But I personally feel that the most effective outreach and the most bang for everyone's buck, everyone's time, is always going to be direct communication. Sometimes you got to call people, and you've got this long list of groups that have been engaged by the census from the Complete Count Committee. I would really hope that some of that direct communication to those groups and others that you identify would really be a cornerstone of that outreach. The other thing that I think about is that I think that the best person that's going to be suited to be leading this should be someone who's local, should be someone who gets our community. And, I hear the demographer talking about bringing in their own private consultants. You can pay someone a lot of money to tell you or build you like nice and shiny looking graphics and social media and all that. But I really don't think there's any substitute for personal relationships, embeddedness in the community. So I would hope that you'd open it up and maybe consider trying to recruit someone from Santa Barbara County who gets our community to really lead this effort. Thanks.
Thank you, sir.
Next, we have Lee Heller, followed by Andy Caldwell.
Good evening, Ms. Heller.
Chair Morris and commissioners, good to see you all. I will second what Mr. Brandt said. I thought those points were well taken, and I'm just going to be a little more nuts and bolts and say I love the idea that you have a working group rather than trying to do this, all 11 of you, because I think it is unwieldy to try to manage things by large committees. And I would encourage you in creating that working group to have diversity of representation because you represent different communities. So for example, Commissioner Rios would probably reach a different population than you, Chair Morris. So making sure you've got the diversity of who you are represented, not all 11 of you, I think would make a big difference. And of course, if everybody's really out there working with local organizations, I think we can get this done and reach a broad community of people. Thank you.
And next is Andy Caldwell.
Good evening, Mr. Caldwell.
Good morning, Chair Morris and members of the commission. Whereas I would concur with the other speakers that direct communication is very, very valuable, I think early on it would behoove you to make a short video. You can make a video of a PowerPoint presentation. You could actually use some of the things that Churchwell did on explaining the priorities or the different things and even introducing who you are. That thing could, go out to lots and lots of people, especially if you ask each organization to put it on their Facebook page or to send it out to their links, et cetera, it could go viral within the county pretty easily. And a video is something that people can watch at their leisure. And I think if you explain who you are, what you're doing, and what your goals are, and a little bit of the time frame, asking people that eventually you would like to be making public live presentations, that you're going to have live meetings, maybe a Zoom webinar and things like that, just to entice them and introduce them to what you're doing. I think that could go a long way. And then also going on interviews. There's several talk shows, there's news shows, and then you can introduce that video, saying this video is here and we're here and this is where our meetings are, et cetera, et cetera. I think that you can at least generate a base of support. Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't see any other hands raised.
Okay, we'll bring this back to the commission. Any final thoughts or points that we want to get on Mr. Johnson's radar screen before we move on? Ms. Turley.
Yeah, so I just checked out. Thank you so much, Norman, for sending that link to the state redistricting site. What I noticed immediately was that they have a very clear timeline. So if it's possible to add to our website some idea of what our timeline is, I think that would be really helpful for the public.
Just for clarification, I don't think the folks in the audience could know the link.
Sorry about that.
No, that's fine. So Mr. Bradley shared the state commission's web address, which is wedrawthelinesca.org. So or maybe I think we've resent it so that it can be viewed publicly. So good resource. Thank you. Appreciate you calling that out. And Ms. Turner, I think you raised a very good question about timeline. And I think one of the items that we'll put on our agenda in the next couple of meetings will be some discussion about what options we have and don't have, and what our strategies may be now that we've got a really compressed timeline. So, because I do think you're right. I think the sooner we can tell people what to expect, probably the better. So maybe Ms. Orden and Mr. Johnson can help us untie the knot that the Census Bureau has left us in. Anything else on the topic of outreach for this evening? If not, Mr. Johnson, I think we will move on to item 7, a training session around the census, demographic, and all the other good kind of data you want us to be experts in.
Yes, thank you. So really 2 parts of this, and this is, we're going to really get into the nuts and bolts so you have an understanding of all the data you'll be hearing about down the road. The first part I'm going to do, which is really a talk about what data is it that we're using, what are the pluses and minuses, and where does it come from. I have a lot of information to share, so I'll kind of pause as I go through each section and see what questions and discussion you may have at that point. And bear with me through that, because at the end of it, Dr. Phillips from the NDC team actually has all of that geographic data that we've been collecting from the county and from all the cities, all now live in both a interactive map and a story map, and he will take you through and introduce you to that. So bear with me through my part, which is kind of the nuts and bolts and boring part. And then I think I'm hoping you'll be very, very happy and engaged with what Mr. Phillips has to show. So with that, I will launch my presentation here. So let me get my control bars out of the way. So there are really 6 totally different sources of data that are used in this process. The one you hear all about, and the one that's got our timeline somewhat up in the air, is the decennial census. It happens every 10 years. They go through and the Census Bureau counts house by house how many people are in the country. And that is a big deal because that is the number used with some minor edits to determine how many people have to be in each district and are the districts close enough to balance. There is some other data in the decennial census. It does look at, out of that total population, how many are Latino, how many are Asian American, how many are Black or African American, and so on. And it also breaks it down into voting age population. How many of those are 18 and by each group? But in California, at least, most of the voting rights discussion, most of the voting rights debates are actually driven by citizen voting age population numbers more than the total population numbers. And we'll get a lot more into that when we talk about the Voting Rights Act. What we really use out of that decennial census is just that total population number. Everything else that we think of as census data, your education levels, your age groups, your renters versus homeowners, all of that data actually doesn't come from the 10-year census. It comes from the American Community Survey, which is run by the Census Bureau. So that is data, and then there's a special tabulation of that the Bureau does that identifies that citizen voting age population data. So as you're all aware, the 2020 census did not ask, are you a citizen? But the American Community Survey actually does. And it doesn't impact it that much because the American Community Survey asks it buried in about 25 pages of questions that their respondents answer. So they found it doesn't suppress the responses as it would with the 2020 census. So all that data we get from the American Community Survey, all your socioeconomic data that comes from the federal government is coming from that American Community Survey and the special tabulation. Then the California statewide database is our source of the prison adjusted decennial census counts. So they're the ones that are going to take that official census count, zero out all the state prisons, and move all those state prisoners back to their last known home address. So that's actually where we will get our total population count, is from the California statewide database. They also provide all the election history. As you know, political data is not part of your considerations, but they also go through the voter file, as I'll talk about a little bit, and identify voters by surname. And so as a supplement to our citizen voting age population numbers, we also get surname Latino, surname Asian American, and surname Filipino data from the statewide database. And then, as you'll see later on, local data. I'll show you a little bit of the American Community Survey and how that's largely by tracts and block groups, and then you'll see how local data can really narrow that down into city blocks. And of course, the big one that is really our big push through the outreach process, and as was mentioned in the public comments, when I talk outreach in this respect, it's very two-way, is all that information and submissions from the residents. One key piece to keep in mind, and this often gets discussions off track, is all of these data have both geographic and numeric components. So things can be geographically accurate, but numerically off. They can be in the right spot, but the wrong numbers, or they can be the right numbers in the wrong spot. Obviously, we hope to bring it all together so that we have the right numbers in the right spot. And I'll talk about these in different ways. So those are the big six to keep in mind. So here we go. So why do we use all this data? What is its purpose? And number one, as I mentioned, comply with the population balance requirement. And that is that total population count. Then, of course, the big number two, comply with the Federal Voting Rights Act. The primary data for that, as I mentioned, is the citizen voting age population data. You'll see, we'll just all start calling that CVAP by the time you're into the map, because it'll be referred to so often. But that's not the only data. As you'll hear when we spend a lot of time on this, that data is supplemented with, as I mentioned, the statewide database data. And then if we really get into the weeds of voting rights complexity, and I don't know if we will with this project or not, then you get into past election data, not looking at partisanship, but looking at the preferences of the different ethnic groups of voters, what the law calls protected classes of voters. And all of that has to be supplemented with the American Community Survey socioeconomic data for voting rights purposes. So you'll hear a lot of talk about citizen voting age population. Actually, Justin Levitt from your legal team wrote a phenomenal paper on don't get hung up on specific percentages. There's a lot of these other factors that go into it, as they'll talk about later on. But all that data is used for compliance with the Federal Voting Rights Act. And then, of course, the big one where you have a lot, the public can really influence the process, where you have a lot of decisions to make, is in identifying and verifying communities of interest. And I say and verify because we've seen through many independent commissions, groups who are trying to subvert the commission's work for their own purposes will bring in some very creative community of interest testimony. I think I've referred before to folks referring to, the little strip mall 2 blocks over from their actual neighborhood that they wanted in because it's the 7-Eleven they go to. Well, and of course, what they were really talking about was they wanted the incumbent that was between them and that strip mall pulled in. So I always talk about identify communities of interest testimony from the public and then verify, primarily from hearing from other residents, but also if someone talks about this is a business area, we should keep it together. As you'll see later on, you can go right to the data and see is what the area they describe really a business area, or is it really a heavily apartment area, that kind of thing. So those are the main purposes is, number one, mathematically, just are you population balanced? Much more complex, are you complying with the Federal Voting Rights Act? And then probably the most complex of all, identifying and verifying your communities of interest. So let me jump into geographic data first. When we talk about census data, it comes out at all different levels. And this is a chart the Census Bureau puts out. The main thing to focus on is this center axis. And this is really the hierarchy. How do all the census geographies stack on top of each other? So at the smallest level, we have census blocks, which I'll talk a little bit about. They're essentially city blocks. Block groups, which are collections of blocks. Tracts, which are roughly speaking big neighborhoods. But most of the tracts were drawn 30 years ago. So the identification of big neighborhoods may not be true today. That's why we rely much more on community input. And then you get counties, states, and the big areas too. The Bureau does split its data off into precincts and into legislative districts and things like that. They tabulate all their data at all these different levels. But ultimately, the data is all about the census blocks. That's the core. Now, to get this graphically, and I've intentionally chosen geographies that aren't in Santa Barbara County for these illustrations, because I don't want my presentation to prejudice you about any geographic areas. But this is an example. So you can see these blocks are really small. They're essentially city blocks. And so the yellow lines are your census blocks. The blue lines are your block groups. And then the black lines you can see are the tracts. So you can really see how a collection of city blocks goes into a big tract, and block groups are really just kind of an intermediate layer that they provide. But you can see the odd shapes, and I'll come back to that later on. So it's a pretty basic idea. You have blocks, they stack into block groups. These things all stack up. The challenge comes when we get into three areas. So the blocks love to follow roads. It's a really easy way for the Census Bureau to identify a census block. Where they run into problems are hills, cul-de-sacs, and houses that are on development boundaries. So you can see in this chart, remember I talked about the yellow lines are the block lines. So it makes sense in here. Obviously, a little city block is a block. But look at this block. It's thrown off because there's a ridge line here. So the Bureau doesn't have anything to draw its geographic line down. Same thing with the cul-de-sacs that come off of this neighborhood. It's really hard for the Bureau to draw a line behind a cul-de-sac because there's no street to use. And then we get in this development, we have the houses on the outside of the street. You know, if you have a walled development, it's usually the houses with the wall behind them. When you get the census block, so in one census block, which is the lowest level of geography we have population counts for, the houses on the outside of this development, the houses in this cul-de-sac, and the houses way over here on the far side of the neighborhood are all in that one block. So when we have hills, we get weird shapes, weird geography. And we really, the moment you try to divide it, say if we want to put these folks into one area and these folks into another, then we're running into messing with the official population data. So something to be aware of. Hills, and Santa Barbara County has a lot of them, cause problems with blocks and cause problems when we try to draw lines because we want to follow the neighborhood lines, but the blocks may not separate them. So just something to be aware of. I did choose this area as an example because it has all of these problems at once. So this is not something you'll run into everywhere, thankfully. Similarly, precincts. This is the ongoing discussion we have with county registrars because they, their big job is with the data is drawing the precincts. And so they want us to minimize how many changes we make to the precincts when we draw these lines. Well, if the precincts don't follow block lines, we're kind of locked in because we don't get data for the precincts. We don't know the Census Bureau's total population for this precinct here outlined in red because it doesn't follow a block. So it's really hard for us to follow that precinct line because we would have to be making up or calculating how many people are here, how many people are here. So that is a challenge. And on the flip side, when we get into, especially the Voting Rights Act side of this, if we do have to go to election data, it is hard for us to then calculate, okay, we have the precinct results from this precinct, but what are the demographics of those voters? Well, we don't really know. Are these voters Latino and these white? Because all we have is the total block number. So keep in mind when you're talking about election data, when we're talking about voter registration data to a degree, there are these rounding offs. And if you take anything from this presentation, just keep in mind that things get rounded off as we work through redistricting and through the census. We also get into some interesting issues. You know, nothing in this world is perfect. The census certainly falls into that category in many, many ways. But when they're drawing census blocks for the whole country, some things go wrong. You can see the Census Bureau has this street wrong. So it thinks the street goes right through here. Historically, back in 1991 or 2001, that didn't really matter because GIS was not nearly as good. So actually the database was, this is street X, and are the houses on the left or right side of it. So if the line went here, it didn't matter because the Census Bureau knew from their people on the street who went door to door, is that house on the left or right, and they counted it correctly. That changed in 2011, and to a degree in 2001, for two reasons. The Bureau started walking along and geocoding every house. Someone with a GPS device went around to literally every driveway and clicked in, I am here. And then the state started geocoding its voter file so that ethnic surname list I mentioned, it is actually geocoded. So while the Census Bureau knows this house is actually on the south side of the road, and so it gets counted in this block in 2001, now that voter in the voter registration database gets counted in this block because the little geocoded dot appears there. So unfortunately, in 2011, this was a big problem because the Census Bureau ran out of money and had to stop its geographic work early. But now, thankfully, they've gone through and done a ton of that work. So most of the time, these kind of odd lines cutting through houses don't happen anymore. But every so often, you will run into a wayward block line, and just know that the people are probably counted in the right block. That's a line like that's not going to throw off your population total, but it might throw off your registration data and some of the other data. The other thing that'll do is if any of you really can dig into this and start comparing 2010 to 2020 data, if you get something that pops up as looking really odd, like a big change where there shouldn't be a change, it's probably something like this, where they fixed the lines and moved people even though it didn't appear to move anyone. So kind of wrapping up the numeric piece of this, keep in mind where we get our geography from, because this determines the precision of the data. So at the household level, we know voter data. We actually get it address by address. So in an apartment building, the state's actually working with data identified, all of the apartments are separate data records that the state is geocoding and coding and locating into the blocks. At the parcel level, as you'll see soon, we get the zoning data. So we can really figure out where are the multifamily houses versus single family houses, but we're still not getting official population counts. It's not until we get to the blocks that we get official census counts of households and that total population data. Now, when we get into the data, you'll see there is citizen voting age population and socioeconomic data by block, but those are what we call disaggregated. We've taken it and we're just kind of estimating as we go down. So the real data comes at the block group for the citizen voting age population data, and then at the tract level for the socioeconomic data. And you'll see this when we get into it. We'll have city block by city block citizen voting age population data, but only block group level education level data. So keep that in mind. If you ever refer back to things later on, this is a great slide to refer back to, and we'll put it up on the website for the public too, just to know that, okay, our zoning data is very, very precise. Our socioeconomic data is captured at a much larger level and is much more general. So, oh, and this is an example, and you'll see local examples of this later when Daniel shows you. You can see the citizen voting age population data. Because we can tie it into block level data, we can estimate it by block. But high school graduation rates, other education data, we only have at the tract or now at the more recently at the block group level. So you get much less precise data from that. So let me stop there and see if you have questions at this point before I go on.
Mr. Bradley and then Mr. Almeida.
I'm interested in missing data if it occurs. Let's just say hypothetically that we have an area where there are data coming from vehicle registrations or from phone numbers, but those, let's say those numbers are much higher than numbers that might be shown from some of the databases that you just showed us. What is then the course of action if we see any very obviously out of alignment data like that?
We'll come back to this a little bit with the criteria discussion. We'll go into more of the population deviations that are allowed. So you can kind of, if you know an area is particularly undercounted, you can deviate the maps. But we are unfortunately required by state law to use those state total population counts. We can't really change those counts and say we know that 500 people were missed. The other challenge is, and this is part of the reason I'm showing the levels of geography, is if we know that a city is undercounted by 10,000, it doesn't do us any good unless we can figure out which block they're in. This is what Los Angeles ran into when it tried to adjust the data back in 2001, when back then it was allowed. There wasn't a state law banning it. They actually brought a team from UCLA, including Leo Estrada, who's probably the preeminent Latino demographer until his passing a couple of years ago. And he spent weeks trying to adjust that data. And he finally reported back to the City Redistricting Commission, whatever I do induces more error than there was to begin with. So that's the challenge. If we could do something at the block level, we could actually go to the Bureau and say there's a problem. And 2 years from now, they'll come back and change the data if they agree with you. But for our purposes, we really are locked in by those numbers outside of the deviation count.
Can you give a quick sense of how much of an anomaly is required to get their attention for reconsideration?
It has to be concrete. So it has to be at that block level. So in 2010, a Navy ship down in San Diego was put on the wrong side of the Coronado Peninsula. And of course, one side of the Coronado Peninsula is the city of San Diego. The other side is the city of Coronado. So they did move 4,000 and some people because the city was able to say, it's a ship. This is where it docks. You put it on the rocks on the Coronado side. So it has to be something concrete like that. And of course, worthy of them making the change. If it's 20 people, it's going to be out of date by the time they rule.
Romero.
Yes, sir. Thanks for your presentation. Just had a question, and maybe getting some more fidelity on some of these particular communities of interest. I noticed when some of the census data was collected, there was some collected from the San Ynez Chumash, specifically from the reservation. I was wondering if you ever also looked at, for example, Indian Health Service data. I know in Alaska, they've worked with certain demographies at the state level to make sure those numbers are correct in terms of misclassification, really being able to identify those indigenous communities of interest. You ever looked at the Indian Health Service data, or is that an option just to make sure, like to Mr. Bradley's point, that we're looking at the correct information?
Yeah. So very briefly, because I do have a lot more still to cover, and I don't want to get too much into the background. Those groups really get weighed in when the Census Bureau is planning the census. So in creating that list of households, and in particular for tribes, there's a lot of group quarters information too. So yes, as you may know, the Census Bureau ends up hiring something like 400,000 people to do the census. And so it really plans out and works with hundreds of thousands of groups across the country to say, where are we sending these people? So that's the stage it really comes into. Those groups don't get to verify or double check the data. It doesn't work that way, unfortunately.
Got it. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Okay.
Okay.
I will jump back in then. So where's my slide? Here we go. Okay. So then getting into the numbers. So that's the geographic data, the shapes that you'll see on the map. Then we get the actual data. And of course, number one, we have our, as I mentioned, our count-based data. It's not a survey, it's not a sample. This is actual door-to-door people counted. And so we have the decennial census, and then actually we have the statewide voter database for its registration data. There's no sampling, there's no margin of error calculations because of sampling. These are actual, we're going to count everyone there. Those counts are then used as controls as the American Community Survey does a survey. So when you see American Community Survey, it's approximately 1 in 14 households have been asked those questions. And so similar to a public opinion poll, but think of it as a massive public opinion poll. Every year, the Census Bureau surveys approximately 1 million households nationwide. So it gets phenomenal data nationally. It's insanely accurate nationally. But out of that 1 million, how many are from, Buellton? So when we get down to those little levels, we're starting to get pretty high margins of error that I'll talk about because we are getting into surveys. Same thing with the citizen voting age population data from the special tabulation. This is survey. It's not that door-to-door count. So if you think that, when you think about the errors in the census, keep in mind that the survey-based data, has those census errors built in and then has its just typical survey margins of error. So this is just a summary of what I was just showing you. So when you get into this, there's 3 pieces of the error to keep in mind with the surveys. One is the confidence level, one is a margin of error, and the third is systematic error. Those of you with PhDs, you've heard about this all your lives because we get hit on this all the time. But number one is the confidence level. How accurate are they trying to be when they structure the survey? So most public opinion polls, they want 95% accuracy, meaning only 1 out of 20 times are they outside the margin of error. So when you hear that a presidential poll has one candidate 5 points ahead, plus or minus 3%, they're 95% sure that that plus or minus 3% is right. Doesn't mean they're sure of the exact number, but they're 95% sure it's in that range mathematically. The American Community Survey is 90% confidence level. So it's a more bigger picture. They accept a little more error. They're 9 times out of 10. They mathematically will be in that range. And they give a margin of error that I'll talk about today and we'll probably never mention again. But because we kind of have to work with the data we have, as I'll talk about later. And then there's always systematic error. This is to the points Commissioner Bradley and Olmedo were raising. This is just the survey was set up wrong. And it can't be measured. You can't calculate a percentage plus or minus for a systematic error. It's just, we missed. You may remember the 2004 presidential election when John Kerry was first called to have won Ohio. And then it turned out Bush in the exit polls. Then it turned out Bush won by quite a bit. Years later, actually a grad student, I think at Berkeley, I'm not sure of that, figured out the systematic error they had was the exit polls were being done by college students, and more conservative voters didn't like to talk to college students outside a polling place. And so that they had a systematic failure there of how they set it up that led to the numbers being wrong. So that's the 3 things. Keep in mind, when we talk about, everyone's familiar with the phrase margin of error, but that is within a confidence level and does not calculate the systematic error. So just a quick example, I won't go through all this, but this is a table showing I believe it's in Colorado. Yeah, Colorado. the number of households, an American Community Survey trying to figure out how many of those households are family households versus non-traditional family households. So, you know, college roommates and that kind of thing. So you see over here, margin of error, the X, that's because the number of households is a count. That comes from the census or from their annual updates at the state and county level, how many households there are. There's no margin of error for counts. And then the American Community Survey is estimating that 1,331,000 and so on households are family households. And their margin of error by percent is plus or minus 0.5%. So obviously this is a state level. There's thousands of surveys involved, very, very accurate. And of course, those get bigger as you go lower. But keep in mind, the systematic error cannot be quantified. If there was some problem in how they counted households, then they're stuck. But there's not really anything we can do about that. It's just something to keep in mind. And again, the whole point of this, hopefully that you'll take away, is the data are invaluable and central to everything we do in redistricting, but most of it is pretty fuzzy too. So this is a part of what I did for National Conference of State Legislatures years ago. But when we look at this, when you're looking at something the size of Phoenix and their estimate of the population, you're getting 0.1% errors. City of Long Beach, 0.0 or 0.02% errors. The data is great. As we get smaller down to a tract level, well, we're getting down to 14% error. You know, and this is a tract in Phoenix. And at the block group level, you can get up to 37% margins of error. So why do we use it? Because it's the best available data. But keep in mind, it's fuzzy. Locally, I pulled some numbers for Santa Barbara. At the county level, just looking at the total citizen voting age population, their estimate is 281,935 citizens of voting age in the county. And their margin of error is fairly confident, less than 1%. In the city of Santa Barbara, we get about 63,600 with a margin of error 2%. Also pretty good, even when we get down to that 60,000 person geography. But when we go down to tracts, and this, I just randomly chose a tract in a block group. This is actually the end of State Street, right before the beach. We're getting 2,000 people and 13.8% margin of error, and then 19.7 in the block group. So as you get lower and smaller, the data gets fuzzier and fuzzier. I actually went through the county and looked at all the block groups, and this block group is actually remarkably accurate because it's so big. The average or the median margin of error for the total population or total CVAP count is 58%, plus or minus 58%. So you get pretty huge when you're looking at individual block group data. So that's just a caution to be aware of. That one thing is, I'll talk about in a minute, people will get very hung up on if this district is 49.9% Latino or that one is 50.1%. Well, keep in mind when we're talking about in a specific area, we got a plus or minus of 30%. Now, when we sum those up to the supervisorial district level, then we're getting back, those errors start to cancel out and rationalize each other. And we're getting back up to plus, we're still at plus or minus 2 or 3%. So don't worry about 50.1 versus 50.2. Worry about, is one seat 54 and the other one 46 kind of thing. So in particular, the fields you'll actually see and refer to a lot. I mentioned the total and voting age population data. That's all broken down by the ethnicities you see here. But in California and actually throughout the Ninth Circuit court states, we're talking about citizen voting age population data for voting rights enforcement. And then we get voter registration and voters casting ballots. That data is often referred to as turnout. Actually, we refer to it as turnout a lot. But keep in mind, it's not going to be a percentage of turnout. It's just counting how many people cast ballots and then which surnames do they have. So we'll get, from the statewide database, we get total voter registration, Spanish surname registration, Asian surname registration, and Filipino. We can break the Asian out into Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, Chinese, or Indian. and Filipinos actually in that same database, but we tend to group them unless there's some community of interest where they've identified a difference. You know, if you get down to Orange County, the Vietnamese and the Koreans often do not consider themselves a joint community of interest because they have different backgrounds, different interests. So we may break them out if those are available. And then we actually, this won't be very much of a factor in Santa Barbara County because there's not a lot of Black or African American population, but we can break out estimates. Again, these are ballpark of the white versus the Black, even though there's no surname list to identify Black voters. There's some interesting registration trends that we found nationally that is in a very, very small geographic area. So in a given city block, Black and African American turnout tends to be about the same or perhaps even better than the white voters in that same city block. So we can use that theory to ballpark estimate those numbers. The other issue is surname data. You know, I'm sure all of you have already gone to the fact that surnames stink. You know, as a racial identifier, if you go by one person's last name, you're almost always going to be wrong. Where this comes into the counts is when you get precinct level data. It tends to, the errors, yes and no, sort of balance out a bit. And the Census Bureau did a study of the surname list that California uses. And they found that net about 10% of the Latinos are missed. So if the Spanish surname list in California says statewide that there are 22%, that's the wrong number. In California, it's going to be about 40% Latino. Well, about 10 or actually 11% of that would be almost 4.5%. So the real number is 44%. So in our data sheets, we actually give you the Spanish surname count from the statewide database, and then this Latino estimate, which uses that Census Bureau data on how off statewide is the surname list. The catch is the surname list varies in how accurate it is in different areas, depending on the likelihood of cross marriage. So if you have, you know, a farm worker community that is migratory and moving back and forth a lot, the Spanish surname list is going to be really accurate because there's, you know, most of those folks are going back and forth to, maybe going back and forth to Mexico. So there's not a lot of cross marriage with Anglo last name groups. But if you're in an area that, you know, if you're in New Mexico where the Hispanics trace their roots to Spain and the families have been there for generations, you get a lot more crossover. So we are doing an assumption there of using the statewide rate, but it's a ballpark estimate to give folks an idea of how that surname error can play out. Is the Spanish surname percentage in our spreadsheet right? Or the Latino percentage in our spreadsheet right? The only thing I can guarantee you is both of them are wrong. Yeah, this is the old thing about predictions and estimates. The only thing we're sure of is that they're not precise, but they are the best available data. The other piece is, you know, everyone talks about socioeconomic data, and we've just done this so much that we think it's invaluable. We actually give this to every project we do. We break out this data long before anyone asks for it. We just say, okay, you're going to need this data to look at communities of interest. We're going to break it out for you. So in every spreadsheet you see from us of demographics and districts, you're going to see an age breakout, percentage of the population that's immigrants, and what percentage of those are naturalized immigrants. You're going to see language spoken at home. The American Community Survey has a weird language fluency breakout. Its main breakout is, do you speak English very well or less than very well? So you really have to dig in, and you get some very error-prone data if you go into who doesn't speak any English versus other levels. But you'll see in every spreadsheet what percentage of population responded they don't speak English very well. They're less than very well. Education levels, high school, college, that kind of stuff. Children living under 18 in the household, household income, multifamily versus single family, and then owner-occupied versus renter. You're going to get that for everybody. Because these are the ones we found tend to be the major ACS categories for identifying communities of interest. Let me then touch on one other piece. and I'm getting close to the end here. Multiple responses in the census. This is the statistician's nightmare. As you may know, for decades, you could only choose one race in the census. And until 1980, they didn't even have Latino as a category. So in 1980, they added Hispanic Latino, but for political and demographic reasons, it's a yes/no question. So you ask yes or no, you're Hispanic/Latino, and then regardless of what you put there, what's your race? And that's where you put white, Black, Asian, Native American. Then starting in 2001, and there's a very kind of classic how Congress makes decisions story behind why this happened. The short version is right before Congress had to vote on whether or not to allow people to choose multiple categories, and they'd always voted no because it messed up the statistics. Right before that vote, Tiger Woods won his first Masters. And suddenly it became the coolest thing in the United States to be half Black, half Thai. And those members of Congress and the committee voting on it could not fall over themselves fast enough to suddenly say they wanted to allow, Tiger Woods to be able to choose both his parents on his form. And thus we now have, instead of 5 or 6 racial categories, 150. Because remember, we don't get individual responses. The individual's response of choosing I'm half Native American, half Latino, we don't see that. We see how many people chose A and B, how many people chose A, B, and C, how many people chose A, B, C, D. So we instantly went from 5 categories to 150. For redistricting, the Office of, that should be OMB, Office of Management and Budget and the Department of Justice realized that was never going to work. You could never draw a voting rights district trying to break out one of 150 categories. And so they gave us guidance on how to group them. So, and this is highly controversial. This gets debated every census, actually more than that, but this is the primary federal guidance with a backup that I'll talk about. But the primary guidance and how most census databases reflect it is if you mark Hispanic or Latino, you are Hispanic or Latino. It doesn't matter what else you mark. Everything else kind of gets dropped out. If you mark white and another race, then you're counted as that other race, what it might be. Native American, African American, anything. If you mark more than one race other than white, so if you mark Native American and African American, then those folks end up in the multiracial group. It's obviously controversial. This is obviously open to different disagreements and interpretations, which is why the federal government stepped in and said, this is the main way we're going to have you tabulate it. Now, there is, of course, a backup, which is if there's a voting rights question regarding Native Americans or regarding African Americans or Asian Americans, the Department of Justice will recalculate that data and will look at how many Latinos also marked that category and recalculate it. But in our citizen voting age population data, we don't get that option. We just get these categories. So we get total citizens voting age, which becomes total, obviously. If someone marks Hispanic or Latino, that's all the data we have. They don't appear anywhere else. And so we can't retabulate that. So your Latino CVAP number includes Latinos who may have marked another race. Then in the Asian Pacific Islander group, we've got those that marked Asian alone, Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander alone, or that marked Asian and white. In the Black or African American category, it's again, those who mark that alone or that in white. And then we get our multi-race responses and our Native American responses. And then we do get non-Hispanic white alone, which is where that number comes from. So just keep in mind when you're looking at the CVAP data, these things are grouped together. It's obviously open to debate. Congress debates this every year. The Department of Justice debates this every year. But this is the data in the format we get it, and we don't have any way to break it out any other way. So getting into communities of interest, getting a little bit more into, well, I guess before I go on to communities of interest, I should pause and see if there's questions about that section before I wrap up here. I do promise I'm almost there.
Mr. Bradley.
I don't want to beat a dead horse to death, but I do want to return one more time to systematic errors. As regards the equalization of population numbers between all 5 districts, do gross differences in systematic errors privilege or disadvantage some districts versus others? In other words, all other priorities aside, and where possible, should systematic errors be distributed evenly between neighboring contiguous districts as a shared liability of the accounting that we're using for counting people?
Let me defer that more to the criteria side if we can, because that, in part because I'd like for the legal team to weigh in on that, and they haven't had a chance to to think about that question yet. And because it's a very complicated answer, because it's not clear.
Okay, thank you.
But we'll definitely come back to that and address that when we get into the population balancing and things like that. Other questions at this point? If not, I'll jump in and I will wrap up here with just the last couple of slides, and then we'll get you to the map. So communities of interest, this is, now we're getting to stuff that is probably already in your head, but some real examples of it. As you've already heard, communities of interest can be defined by all kinds of things, legal or other official boundaries, data, and most of all by testimony. As you hear testimony and as we start mapping this stuff, people will disagree. And the LA Times did a fascinating project years ago, it must be 12 years ago or so now, where they went around and said, okay, this is the West Adams neighborhood. We know there's a West Adams neighborhood. What do you consider the boundary of that neighborhood? And they mapped 95% of the folks that responded included this core area. 80% of them then included this area. And then 50% of them extended it all the way out this far. And it really captured the thought of how you're going to get community of interest testimony. And of course, by the time you get out to the outer ring, all of your communities of interest are overlapping. And that's where the decisions really come into, we're going to keep this one together or that one together. So keep in mind that idea of identifying cores and maybe outer rings of communities of interest. Because if you do end up having to draw a line in the area of that community, that may be a decision you face is, we don't want to just say split it in half. We want to think about trying to keep the core together, and maybe the areas that might identify with that area and with the neighboring area are more flexible to go either way. Communities, and this is where I got into the data. Data can help verify your communities and identify communities. Communities defined by issues may not be equally communities at different levels of government. So for example, in Arizona, if you know the Verde Valley, beautiful area, it's right near Sedona, very, very water driven. And so in Arizona, water issues are really decided by the legislature. So clearly a community of interest for legislative issues, the county has no say over water issues at all in Arizona. And so not really as defined by their water issue, it's not really an issue for county supervisorial districting. So keep in mind that tie, a community at one level may or may not also consider itself a community at another level of government. And when we get into unincorporated areas, this is where it's often the toughest because there's no city boundary. There's few official boundaries, but we do have some data, as you'll see. This is North LA County, there's the cities of Lancaster and Palmdale, and then lots of people living in unincorporated areas. Well, keep in mind, a lot of people aren't familiar with the idea of spheres of influence, but LAFCO, this very unknown county agency, has identified each city's sphere of influence where the city actually controls planning, essentially the zoning for that area. So obviously clear community ties. So as we're looking to, okay, we have a district centered in Lancaster, who do we add to it to bring it up to population? Well, the sphere of influence is the obvious next step. And then there's CDPs or census designated places. And these are unincorporated neighborhoods the census has identified. They're not officially recognized. Commissioner Almeida, to your point earlier, they don't go in and say to the residents, what's the boundary? They just kind of guess at it. So CDPs, when you see them on the map, they'll identify with names that you recognize, but don't necessarily wed yourself to the lines bordering them. If a resident disagrees with that line, I would go with the resident every time. So, and remember that data cannot defend itself. So, we use data to review and confirm public claims where someone's citing some data element is justifying their claim. We can use that data to check it. But ultimately, we do want to encourage and empower that public input and rely on it as much as possible. So my final thoughts, I've really covered these already, so I'll skip through them, but you will hear about Congress needing exact population data. I think you all probably have a pretty good sense now that that's a little bit silly for the courts to require deviations of one person in a 700,000 person district. It's artificial, but it works for the courts. And then you'll get these bright line tests that you'll hear about. Keep in mind, they are important from a legal perspective, but as we've talked about, and I think you all have a good understanding of now, there's a lot of fuzziness in that CVAP data, especially when you get smaller. County supervisor districts are pretty good in being rather large. You can imagine when we get into drawing council district lines in, say, Solvang or Buellton, the margins of error are massive. And our guiding rules, really, if you take away two things from this, well, three things from this, one would be that data are fuzzy, that there is error in just about all this data. There's no way to avoid it. But number two, if the statutes of the courts say to use given data, we kind of have to use it within the context of what we've discussed with Commissioner Bradley, and we'll come back to, where we have a range of play in there. And then for all the problems with the data, for all the lack of precision, the issues of surnames, those kinds of things, we do want to use the best available data. It's never going to be perfect, but it's the best available. That's why courts rely on the surname data, is that it's the best available in many areas where the CVAP data isn't available or the CVAP data is not good, or where you get odd things happening in the CVAP data. Same thing with the surname data. If you have a lot of Filipinos, as Commissioner Rios is talking about up in Santa Maria, that's going to skew your Spanish surname numbers. And Portuguese. Oh, in the Central Valley, we really have to watch for Portuguese neighborhoods because those Hispanic numbers go through the roof very quickly. So, and the middle one here is the key. Trust the data, but understand its imprecision. So, and then this PowerPoint is posted, so we got some references for folks. So now that you've suffered through my presentation, I will take any questions, and then Mr. Phillips will get into what we put together is an interactive map of these different geographic layers for Santa Barbara County. But before I get to that, any questions? No?
Yeah. Mr. Bradley.
In terms of our outreach, which we were speaking of earlier this evening, and getting testimony for defining communities of interest, when it comes down to issues of political or issue-based salience, we have districts, for example, that are focused on particular issues around which they may rally as a community of interest. How do we weigh that kind of testimony against the kinds of logistical data that you've been showing us, where we have, hard artifacts that we can point to? Is there any case history or legal precedents where we can privilege one to the other or weigh them against each other? I know that's a very complex question, but at some point I'd like to get to that too.
Yeah, I think, I won't weigh in on the legal side of it, but ultimately it's your decision. You heard a little bit from Chairman Lynn about Arizona last time, where the Hopi and the Navajo went back and forth, and the Navajo gave all the pitches about how unified they were and how they were a shared community of interest. And the Hopi followed with, no, we aren't, we don't get along. And ultimately the commission decided, well, at the congressional level, that's where all the tribal issues get decided. Congress decides tribal issues. So at Congress, they split them. And then like for healthcare issues and state related issues, that they really get along much better. And so they put them in the same district. So that kind of discretion is up to you. the legal team will follow up if they have more information, but I don't think there's certainly no bright line test. And one of the reasons I asked Dr. Phillips to put this map together is, in addition to having your standard presentation when you go out, you will see this map. And as residents are talking to you about a given neighborhood, you'll be able to zoom in on that neighborhood. And if they tell you, well, we go north about 4 blocks, you'll be able to use this map to zoom in and say, oh, does it go up to 4th Street or 5th Street? And really show them and actually bring up satellite images and everything. So hopefully you'll resolve it in the middle of that public comment. I will say I have asked Dr. Phillips to only take about 10 minutes. So he's going to give you a taste of this and an introduction to this, but you'll see there's so much in it. You'll hopefully want to go home, spend some time on it. And unless there's any other questions, I will have her have him go into that now. Anything else? Otherwise, Daniel, take it away.
All right. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Oh, I don't have the ability to share my screen. So if someone could give me that ability, that would be great.
Yeah.
Okay, I have it. So let me share my screen with you. And you should be able to see a web page here. Can everyone see it? Okay.
Oh, Daniel, let me add this page on the commission homepage. This is already there. You'll see a story map link. That's this page.
Yes, yes. So you all should have access to this web page, and members of the public should have access to this web page as well. It's titled GIS Data for Santa Barbara County, as in Geographic Information Systems. And we collected this from a lot of sources, official sources. And there's a ton of data. And of course, I encourage you to go through it on your own time and at your own pace to see it all. But I'm just going to walk you through kind of the basics of how to navigate and highlight a few interesting tidbits. So let me just start by saying that you just scroll normally through this page, and that is how you navigate through all the different slides. And you will encounter different sections. So this first section is called Census Areas. And you'll see at the bottom left here, there's a little marker that says there are 8 slides in this section, and this is the first of those slides. And so as you scroll, you will see the text go down, and so you can read what the text says and then see the map on the right that the text is referring to. And then you go to the next slide and you come to this next map. And this slide is about census places, which are cities and CDPs. So we have in Santa Barbara County, in red are the incorporated cities such as Lompoc, Buellton, and Solvang. And then the census designated places are in the unincorporated areas. So they're not cities themselves, but they are still recognized places. And redistricting law requires keeping each of these places intact to the extent practicable. But just so you know, it is not the most important criterion. There are keeping communities of interest together are more important, but it's still one of the criteria to consider. Now, let me just show you that you can pan and see throughout the map different cities. So you can go over here and look at the places on the South Coast. You could go over here and look at the ones in North County. And bottom right here, you see the option to zoom in and zoom out. And so you can come in a little closer and eventually you'll be able to see the different streets with their names. So zoom out again and you see more of the county. And this little button here at the bottom left is the legend. And there you'll be able to see what the different symbols refer to. So that is the first slide I want to highlight. Then I would like to go down a little further and show you a piece of ACS data, American Community Survey data, and this is Latino CVAP. And this is focused on the city of Lompoc. And here you will see that the warmer colors refer to higher percentages of Latino CVAPs in given census blocks. So these little tiny blocks, the ones that have the warmest colors have the highest percentages. So you see a lot of inner Lompoc has high Hispanic Latino percentages. But when you get out toward Mission Hills and Vandenberg Village, it's you see these cooler colors, which means a lower percentage. And if you click the legend, you can see what each of those colors refer to as far as the exact percentages. Now, and if you wanted to go check out what it looks like in other areas, you have that option as well. So you see here a few Hispanics in the Orchid area, but quite a few in Santa Maria. Now I'm going to skip ahead to, I'm going to skip through the special districts. There's a lot of special districts that are in the county. There's also a lot of emergency response areas that are in the county. And you see here some examples of that, but I'm just going to skip through that because there's a lot to cover here and I want to make sure I highlight what I think are some of the most important aspects. Of course, people differ about what is important. Some people have certain issues that are more important to them than other issues and other people. So this is just something that I thought would be interesting to highlight. And that is elementary school attendance areas in North County specifically. And you see that you have the different elementary school attendance areas. They have black boundaries. So once you see a black boundary, that means you are looking at a different school's attendance zone. So this is one school's attendance zone and this is another school's. But notice that they are the same light blue color. That means they are in the same school district. If you go over to here to Libin Elementary School, that is in Santa Maria Bonita School District as opposed to Orchid Union. And if you click the legend, you should be able to see what each of the colors refers to as far as the school district. And I have that for middle schools and high schools as well. So just an example here of the type of attendance areas you can look at. Now I'm going to skip ahead to the next section, which is about voting districts. And the thing that you should be aware of about voting districts is that these are the current post-2010 census districts. So these are all going to be redrawn post-2020, including the supervisorial district lines, like of course you will do. So these are not going to be permanent, just presenting these here for reference and to consider why maybe some of these lines might have been drawn where they were. So if we go down to city council districts, we can see Lompoc City Council districts. It has 4. Santa Barbara, it has 6. Notice here you also have the sphere of influence of the city of Santa Barbara shown in a lighter red. So these areas are not in the city of Santa Barbara itself, it's sphere of influence. Something I do want to highlight is that the labeling might be a little tricky because I had no control over how the labels would show up. District 5 is here, which is over a area that is not in the city of Santa Barbara. But the reason it shows up there is because there is a portion of the city of Santa Barbara in the airport that is in its District 5. And so the program just places it in the middle of all the extent of that district. But most of the district is actually right here. So just something to be aware of. And then we have Santa Maria's city council districts as well. And then the final thing I want to highlight is this issue of land use and zoning. So there is actually a county-wide land use data file. And this is just showing one portion of the county, but you can see it anywhere in the county. And what it does is it categorizes every parcel in the county according to these 10 broad categories. And you'll see them listed here, also in the legend. And you can zoom in and get pretty detailed sense of where low density residential houses might be versus higher density apartments. And you can see where the commercial areas are, etc. So that is the last section, the land use and zoning section. And you can look at the individual cities and how they have their own zoning schemes. So there are 8 cities in our county, and Solvang is the last alphabetically. So you can go through all those if you want. And the final thing to point out is that if you want to explore the data some more, you have the option of clicking this link, which will take you to a web application. And you should be able to see that it is loading now. It might take a few seconds to load because, again, there's a lot of data to see here. But Doug, can you tell me if this is visible?
Yes, I'm getting the map. Oh yeah, there's the text.
Okay, great. So what you'll see is that there's a sidebar that gives a little description of what this is and how to use it. You have the different layers that you can select and deselect. So you can display as many layers at once as you would like. So percent renter housing could be one. You could show the lighting districts. You could show the sanitary districts and see how they overlap. And you can do all the things you did in the story map relative to zooming in and panning. You see the zoom in and zoom out at the top left here. And then the legend would be at the bottom left here. So this is the platform you can use if you want to have the total freedom to go around and show all the layers you want and adjust their transparency and things like that. So a lot to explore here, and I hope you enjoy doing so. And that is all I have to present for now.
And I would just wrap up quickly saying, definitely go through that story map first, and it'll take you through, as Mr. Rafferty has talked about, this is a fascinating exploration of your own county. And then as you go through it and you say, well, what if I overlay this with that from the different pieces of the story map, that application will let you do that. You can turn on whatever layers you want at the end.
And Doug, just once more for everybody, where is that? What's the URL for that site?
Actually, if you go to the commission website, the commission homepage, it's right at the top. It'll say there's 2 links. One is to the story map, which is where you began, and the other one is to the web app.
Good. Commissioners, any questions? Mr. McClintock.
Thanks, Dr. Phillips. This is great. This is just a tremendous amount of information and data, and I'm looking forward to diving into it. On the web app, I noticed the description for the layers links to the sort of standard Esri metadata, which is not super helpful. And as I'm trying to interpret these data, it'd be nice if those descriptions could link to some sort of, I don't know, document that helps me understand where those data come from and their limitations and so on. Is that something that you can do and I mean, reasonably also to add some useful descriptions to those layers, or is that sort of too much work?
So to clarify, what you would like is a description of what each layer is showing in addition to its basic title.
Right.
Well as,
yeah, because, based on Doug's earlier presentation about, how to use count data versus survey data, and how are these information collected, and what are the margins of error and all that sort of stuff. Like I want to know how I can trust these data by reading a description, and that information isn't in that Esri metadata.
Yeah. So I was able to write a description for each of the data layers, but the platform doesn't have the ability to show those
Gotcha.
descriptions. So perhaps I could make some sort of spreadsheet or something that would show all the actual titles of the layers, and then have a reference to its source in a more in-depth description of what that layer is for.
That would do it. Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, and ultimately what we may do, because Daniel's been spending the last few weeks gathering all this data, you know, as you've talked about, there's no central spot for this in Santa Barbara County. So we may also just be able to link you back to the original source, or in many cases sources of the data he's put together. They would have that kind of metadata.
Perfect. Thank you.
Anyone else? Mr. Ray.
Just a very elementary question. What is a lighting district?
Yeah, I think it has something to do with providing streetlights, and but someone can correct me if I'm wrong.
It's a fee district, Jim, that the city or county imposes to collect fees to pay for maintenance and upkeep of lighting. Street lights, things like that.
Yeah, you'll often see referred to as lighting and landscaping, because they're usually the street lights and the street median landscaping costs. But if you're in one, you know it, because you get taxed for it.
Right.
Again,
Doug, any final comments before we invite the public to make some comments?
Yeah, I was gonna say the main goal of this was to give you a taste, and hopefully you'll go home and make a meal of it. So certainly this is something we anticipate you guys using when you're out in the community, and hopefully the residents using. And so hopefully folks will dig into it, and we'll come back to this many times in the future too.
Okay, let's take a pause for a moment and see if anybody from our viewing public wants to weigh in with a comment this evening on this item. Ms. Tilton, any takers?
I don't see any hands raised from the public to speak on this.
Going once, going twice. All right, we'll bring this back. Commissioners, any final comments or thoughts before we move on to our next agenda item? Okay. Doug and Daniel, thank you for that information. It's a lot to chew on all at once, but we'll get through it. Commissioners, we're going to go to item number 8, which is a discussion of and maybe some decisions about what our next couple of training sessions look like. Doug, why don't we mentioned this earlier, but do you want to kind of preview again what's on the menu for the next couple of meetings?
Yeah, so at the next meeting, the thought is for the training portion of it to focus on the criteria. So we've talked before about the list of criteria. This will be more at looking at sample maps from other jurisdictions of what is compact, what is not compact, how the different criteria balance off each other. And thankfully now that that Andrea and her team are on board, they will be, the thought is we'll work with them and they can comment on some of the stuff as well and the legal background of it. And then the one obvious criteria that is a big piece, too big for just rolling into that little discussion, is the Federal Voting Rights Act. And that will be the final topic of training, kind of the close of the big one, and also to give your legal team time to prepare that, having since they've only officially been on board for hours, I think, at this point. And then we'll come back. The thought is after that to have not really a training session, but kind of a semi-training session where we'd show you examples of what a lot of commissions have run into in the past, taking all these different pieces. But that will be more just a discussion and application, not anything new. So if you're comfortable with all that, we'll proceed with that, or we're happy to take any guidance you might have.
Anything you folks think we're missing for those next 2 or 3 that you want to make sure we get covered? Ms. Trusky. You're on mute still. There we go.
I think you alluded to the fact that we would be talking more about ex parte, and, because we're going to be out in the public, and, what rises to the level of ex parte if we are to be the voice of the commission. And so I need a little more guidance there.
And I think that's one of the ones that is listed, and maybe we should just do it next time as one of the first of all of these items, sort of the nuts and bolts of the running of the meeting, maybe talking even a little bit about public comment. And of course, we mentioned also the social media communications with the press. So I think everyone is interested in that, and it makes sense to do it next time.
Ms. Turley.
Yeah, adding to that a bit, I remember in the original, one of the original sessions, it was mentioned that there would possibly be county email addresses for us. And I'm just curious, especially in regards to Scott Rafferty's public comment, whether or not that is something that we are considering or will have access to. So yeah, I would like to hear more about that.
I can certainly find out. I have no idea of what the policies are for the county to do that, but I can certainly know that next time.
Fantastic. Okay, folks, I think that gets us through the open portion of our agenda for this evening. We are going to go to closed session at this time to meet with our legal counsel. I don't know, Ms. Tilton or Ms. Orden, do one of you want to just quickly introduce what we'll be discussing, and then Ms. Orden, I think we should probably offer an opportunity for comment about that before we break. Is that accurate?
I agree.
Okay. Can you give us a quick summary of the agenda for that closed session?
Yes. We have noticed 2 items on the agenda for closed session under anticipated litigation, and they've been adequately noticed by the code section and the fact that it's anticipated litigation. But in order that it makes it clearer for people for public comment, we also will announce what they are. One of them is the Coalition of Labor, Agriculture, and Business versus Santa Barbara County Board of Supervisors. And also sued was the County of Santa Barbara Citizens Independent Redistricting Commission. The other item it relates to, and in the packet, is a letter that has been received by the chairman, and it comes from the California Hispanic Chambers of Commerce, as well as the Santa Barbara County Republican Party.
Very good, thank you. So before we go to closed session, we'll give the folks in the public a chance to make any comments. Ms. Tilton, any speakers on this item?
I'm not showing any hands raised to speak.
Nope, we got one late one.
Oh. I'm sorry, I'm not seeing it.
Looks like Scott Rafferty.
Okay, my apologies. Scott Rafferty.
There we go. Mr. Rafferty, welcome back.
Thank you. I just want to clarify some questions I have about your authority to litigate. Your records are county records, and I understand that from the county council that they expect to search and produce private records that have private accounts that have been used for county business. And there's some outstanding issues on that, but they're responsible for your compliance. You're required, of course, to comply with the Brown Act. But when I set up an independent commission for a school district, which is actually quite different, there was considerable discussion about litigation authority. And as I understand the general law, and I don't see anything in the statute regarding independent commissions, the county council is responsible for litigating to the extent he sees fit in issues that you get involved in. I am concerned about you having just a blank check because you are actually, I've looked enough at the maps to know that drawing the majority Latino district is going to be a very painful and controversial exercise. And if there's a problem with it, it's the county should be responsible for deciding how much you're going to spend on, how much county money you're going to spend defending that. So that's something that I think you should talk more publicly about if you believe that you have a blank check, because I think that's problematic.
Thank you, sir. Any others?
I don't see any other hands raised.
Okay. We will then recess for closed session. Commissioners, you should again have received a second meeting link that we will use to convene in our closed session. For the attendee viewers from the public, we will be back at the conclusion of closed session to announce any action taken and to adjourn our meeting this evening. So we will do our best to make this expeditious, and we'll be back with you as soon as we possibly can. Commissioners, we will meet in the other Zoom room in short order. So we will stand in recess now. Thank you. That's okay. Do we have a quorum back yet? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Or at least at a quorum. So we will call the meeting back in order. And let's see. We should probably wait until Andrea rolls in.
Do you want me to step in just so you guys can finally get off?
Yeah,
off the lives a little
Mr.
bit?
Butcher,
Okay,
yeah, would you be so kind as to report any actions taken in closed session?
Yeah, there are no reportable actions. The commission met and received guidance from their counsel on the status of one anticipated matter and one matter that was originally anticipated that became an existing litigation item, but there was no reportable action taken.
Very well. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I believe we are done for the evening. We will reconvene. Let me find my calendar really fast. Ms. Tilton, you probably have it in front of you.
Yeah, the next meeting will be April 7th, followed by April 21st at 6 p.m.
Very well. We will see everybody on the 7th. Have a good evening, folks. Thank you. Meeting
Good
adjourned.
evening, folks. Thank you.